Gators, here's chapter 1 of The Indian in the Cupboard by Lynn Reed Banks. Chapter 1 is called Birthday Presents. It was not that Omri didn't appreciate Patrick's birthday present to him. Far from it. He was really very grateful. Sort of. It was, without a doubt, very kind of Patrick to give Omri anything at all, let alone a second-hand plastic Indian that he himself had finished playing with. The trouble was, though, that Omri was getting a little fed up with small plastic figures, of which he had loads of already. Biscuit tinfuls, probably 3 or 4 if they were all put away at the same time, which they never were because most of the time they were scattered about in the bathroom, the loft, the kitchen, the breakfast room, not to mention Omri's bedroom, and the garden. The compost heap was full of soldiers, which over several autumns had been raked up with the leaves by Omri's mother, who was rather careless about such things. Omri and Patrick had spent many hours together playing with their joint collections of plastic toys, but now they had enough of them, at least for the moment, and that was why, when Patrick brought his present to school on Omri's birthday, Omri was disappointed. He tried not to show it, but he was. "Do you really like him?" asked Patrick, as Omri stood silently with the Indian in his hand. "Yes, he's fantastic," said Omri, in only a slightly flattish voice. "I haven't got an Indian." "I know. I haven't got any cowboys either. Nor have I. That's why I couldn't play with anything, or I couldn't play anything with him." Omri opened his mouth to say, "I won't be able to either," but thinking that might hurt Patrick's feelings, he said nothing, put the Indian in his pocket, and forgot about it. After school, there was a family tea, and all the excitement of his presents from his parents and his 2 older brothers. He got his dearest wish, a skateboard complete with kryptonic wheels, from his mom and dad, and from his oldest brother, Ediel, a helmet. Gillian, his other brother, hadn't brought him anything because he had no money. His pocket money had been stopped some time ago in connection with a very unfortunate accident involving their father's bicycle. So he said pocket money. And remember, this takes place in England, and the way they say things is a little bit different. Pocket money means his allowance. So it sounds like his brother Gillian didn't do something correctly with his father's bicycle. So his allowance has been stopped for right now. So when Gillian's turn came to give Omri a present, Omri was very surprised when a large parcel was put before Omri. It was untidily wrapped in brown paper and string. "What is it? Have a look. I found it in the alley." The alley was a narrow passage that ran along the bottom of the garden where the dustbins stood. The 3 boys used to play there sometimes and occasionally found treasures that were otherwise perhaps richer neighbors had thrown away. So Omri was quite excited as he tore off the paper. Inside was a small white metal cupboard with a mirror in the door, the kind you see over the basin in an old-fashioned bathroom. So it kind of looks like a medicine cupboard that you have above your sink in the bathroom. You might suppose Omri would get another disappointment about this, because the cupboard was fairly plain, and except for a shelf, completely empty. But oddly enough, he was very pleased with it. He loved cupboards of any sort because of the fun of keeping things in them. He was not a very tidy boy in general, but he did like arranging things in cupboards and drawers, and then opening them later and finding them just as he had left them. "I do wish it locked," he said. "You might say thank you before you start complaining," said Gillian. "It's got a keyhole," said their mother, "and I've got a whole box full of keys. Why don't you try the smaller ones and see if any of them fit?" Most of the keys were much too big, but there were half a dozen that were about the right size. All but one of them were very ordinary. The unordinary one was the most interesting key in the whole collection. Small, with a complicated lock part and a fancy top. A narrow strip of red satin ribbon was looped through one of its curly openings. Omri saved that key for last. None of the others fit, and at last he picked up the curly-topped key and carefully put it in the keyhole on the cupboard door, just below the knob. He did hope very much that it would turn. and regretted wasting his birthday cake cutting wish on something so silly, or rather unlikely, as that he might pass his spelling test the next day, which it would take real magic to bring about, as he hadn't even looked at the words since they were given 4 days ago. Now he closed his eyes and unwished that he would pass the test, and wished that this little twisty key would turn Gillian's present into a secret cupboard. The key turned smoothly in the lock. The door wouldn't open. "Hey, Mom! I found one!" "Have you, darling? Which one?" The mother came to look. "Oh, that one! How very odd. That was the key to my grandma's jewel box that she got from Florence. It was made of red leather, and it fell to bits at last, but she kept the key and gave it to me. She was most terribly poor when she died, poor old sweetie, and kept crying because she had nothing to leave me. So in the end, I said I'd rather have this little key than all the jewels in the world. I threaded it on that little bit of ribbon. It was much longer then, and hung it around my neck. And I told her I'd always wear it and remember her. And I did for a long time. But then the ribbon broke, and I nearly lost it." "You could have gotten a chain for it," said Omri. She looked at him. "You're right," she said. "I should have done just that, but I didn't. And now it's your cupboard key. Please don't lose it, Omri, will you?" Omri put the cupboard on his bedside table, and opening it, looked inside thoughtfully. "What would he put in it?" "It's supposed to be for medicine," said Gillian. "You could put your nose drops in it." "No, that's just wasting it. Besides, I haven't any other medicines." "Why don't you pop this in?" the mother suggested, opened her hand, and in it was Patrick's Indian. "I found it when I was putting your trousers in the washing machine." Omri stood the Indian on the shelf. There's the picture of Omri at his little birthday celebration with his family. "Are you going to shut the door?" asked his mother. "Yes, and lock it." He did this and kissed his mother, and she turned the light out and lay down on his side, looking at the cupboard. He felt very content. Just as he was dropping off to sleep, his eyes snapped open. He had thought he heard a little noise, but no, all was quiet. His eyes closed again. In the morning, there was no doubt about it. The noise actually woke him. He lay perfectly still in the dawn light, staring at the cupboard, from which was now coming a most extraordinary series of sounds. A pattering, a tapping, a scabbing, and surely a high-pitched noise, almost like a tiny little voice. To be truthful, Omri was petrified. Who wouldn't be? Undoubtedly, there was something alive in that cupboard. At last, he put his hand out and touched it. He pulled very carefully. The door was shut tight, but as he pulled, the cupboard moved, just slightly. The noise from inside instantly stopped. He laid still for a long time, wondering, had he imagined it? The noise did not start again. At last, he cautiously turned the key and opened the cupboard door. The Indian was gone. Omri sat up sharply in bed and peered into the dark corners. Suddenly, he saw him, but he wasn't on the shelf anymore. He was in the bottom of the cupboard, and he wasn't standing upright. He was crouching in the darkest corner, half hidden by the front of the cupboard, and he was alive. Omri knew that immediately. To begin with, though, the Indian was trying to keep perfectly still as Omri had kept, lying in bed a moment ago. He was breathing heavily. His bare bronze shoulders rose and fell and were shiny with sweat. The single feather sticking out of the back of his headband quivered, as if the Indian were trembling. And as Omri peered closer and his breath fell on the tiny huddled figure, he saw it jump to its feet. Its minute hand made a sudden darting movement towards its belt and came to rest clutching the handle of a knife, smaller than the shaft of a tack. So his knife was just a little bit smaller than a little tack, the little metal part on a tack. Neither Omri nor the Indian moved for perhaps a minute and a half. They hardly breathed either. They just stared at each other. The Indian's eyes were black and fierce and frightened. His lips were drawn back from shiny white teeth, so small you could scarcely see them except when they caught the light. He stood pressed against the wall of the cupboard, clutching his knife, rigid with terror, but defiant. The first coherent thought that came into Omri's mind as he began to get over the shock was, "I must call the others," meaning his parents and his brothers. But something, he wasn't sure what, stopped him. Maybe he was afraid that if he took his eyes off the Indian for even a moment, he would vanish or become plastic again. And then when the others came running, they would all laugh and accuse Omri of making things up. And who could blame anyone for not believing this unless they saw it with their own two eyes? Another reason Omri didn't call anyone was that if he was not dreaming and the Indian had really come to life, it was certainly the most marvelous thing that had ever happened to Omri in his life, and he wanted to keep it to himself, at least at first. The next thought was that he must somehow get the Indian in his hand. He didn't want to frighten him any further, but he had to touch him. He simply had to. He reached his hand slowly into the cupboard. The Indian gave a fantastic leap into the air. His black hair flew and the fringes on his leggings fluttered. His knife raised above his head flashed. He gave a shout, which, even though it was a tiny shout to match his tiny body, was nevertheless loud enough to make Omri jump. But not so deeply he jumped when the knife pierced his finger deeply enough to draw a drop of blood. Omri stuck his finger into his mouth and sucked it, and thought how gigantic he must look to this tiny Indian, and how fantastically brave he had been to stab him. The Indian stood there, his feet in moccasins planted apart on the white painted metal floor, his chest heaving, his knife held already, and his black eyes quite wild. Omri thought he was magnificent. "I won't hurt you," he said. "I only want to pick you up." The Indian opened his mouth, and a stream of words spoken in that loud, tiny voice came out, not one of which Omri could understand. "Don't you speak English?" asked Omri. All the Indians in films spoke a sort of English. It would be terrible if this Indian couldn't. How would they talk to each other? The Indian lowered his knife a fraction. "I speak," he grunted. Omri breathed deeply in relief. "Oh, good. Listen, I don't know how it happened that you came to life, but it must be something to do with this cupboard, or perhaps the key. Anyway, here you are, and I think you're great. I don't mind that you stabbed me. Only please, can I pick you up? After all, you are my Indian," he finished in a very reasonable tone. He said all this very quickly while the Indian stared at him. The knife point went down a little farther, but he didn't answer. "Well, can I? Say something," urged Omri impatiently. "I speak slowly," grunted the miniature Indian at last. There's Omri in his room playing with the cupboard and the plastic Indian. "Oh," Omri thought, and then said very slowly, "Let me pick you up." The knife came up again in an instant, and the Indian's knees bent into a crouch. "No." "Oh, please." "You touch, I kill," the Indian growled ferociously. You might have expected Omri to laugh at this absurd threat from a tiny creature scarcely bigger than his middle finger, armed with only a pinpoint. But Omri didn't laugh. He didn't even feel like laughing. This Indian, his Indian, was behaving in every way like a real live Indian. Brave, and despite the vast difference in their sizes and strengths. Omri respected him, and even, odd as it sounds, feared him at that very moment. "Oh, okay, I won't then. But there's no need to get angry. I don't want to hurt you." Then, as the Indian looked baffled, he said in what he supposed was Indian English, "Me no hurt you." "You come near, I hurt you," said the Indian swiftly. Omri had been half lying in bed all this time. Now, cautiously and slowly, he got up. His heart was thundering in his chest. He couldn't be sure why he was being cautious. Was it so as not to frighten the Indian, or because he was frightened himself? He wished one of his brothers would come in, better still, his father, but no one came. Standing in his bare feet, he took the cupboard by its top corners and turned it till it faced the window. He did this very carefully, but nevertheless the Indian was jolted, and having nothing to hold on to, he fell down. But he was on his feet again in a second, and he had not let go of his knife. "Sorry," said Omri. The Indian responded with a noise like a snarl. There was no more conversation for the next few minutes. Omri looked at the Indian in the early sunlight. He was a splendid sight. He was just under 3 inches tall. His blue-black hair done in a plait and pressed to his head by a colored headband gleamed in the sun. So did his tiny little muscles on his torso and the skin of his arms. His legs were covered with buckskin leggings, which had some decoration on them, too small to see properly. He wore a kind of band across his chest, and his belt seemed to be made of several strands of some shiny white beads. Ooh, I wonder what that might be. A belt made of shiny beads. We learned about that at the beginning of the school year. Wonder, and you made them in art class. Do you remember what those are called? Omri found himself wondering, not for the first time recently, where his magnifying glass was. It was the only way he would ever be able to see and appreciate the intricate details of the Indian's clothes. Omri looked as closely as he dared at the Indian's face. He expected to see paint on it, war paint, but there was none. The tricky feather that had been stuck in his headband had come out when the Indian fell and was now laying on the floor of the cupboard. It was about as big as the spike on a horse chestnut, but it was a real feather. Omri suddenly asked, "Were you always this small?" "I not small, you big," the Indian shouted angrily. He heard his mother beginning to move about next door. The Indian heard it too, and he froze. The door of the next room opened. Omri knew that at any moment his mother would come in to wake him for school. In a flash, he had bent down and whispered, "Don't worry, I'll be back." And he closed and locked the cupboard door and jumped back into bed. "Come on, Omri, time to get up." His mom came into the bedroom and bent down and kissed him, paying no attention to the cupboard, and went out again, leaving the door wide open. That's the end of chapter 1. Chapter 2 is called The Door is Shut. So I hope you like that first chapter, and you continue to follow along to find out what happens with Omri in his secret cupboard. I hope you have a happy Easter.